They arrived before the sun had fully climbed, a line of weary shapes and quiet disbelief stepping down from a freight train onto the hot Texas ballast. Rumors had hardened in their mouths into a single brittle question: what would come next? In the heat and dust of that morning, the answer took the form of order. Neat rows of white canvas, a low hum of a generator, a flagpole already planted in a cleared yard, and, unexpectedly, hands that moved with purpose rather than menace. If you find stories like this worth remembering, please like, subscribe, and stay with the story to the end. The platform smelled of oil and dust. It smelled of travel. Guards pointed. Men in olive drab called names from clipboards, and one by one the women, German civilians and soldiers rounded together in the confusion of retreat, were guided toward the intake tent at Camp Hearn. Ilse had her knuckles white where she gripped the strap of a cracked handbag. Marta walked with a stooped balance, as if conserving strength for the steps she could not yet afford to waste. Elsa kept her chin high. Once a nurse, she watched the Americans with an inscrutable appraisal. Greta clutched a folded scrap of fabric to her chest. Anna, younger than the others and still freckled from rural sun, counted silently the number of tents as if counting steps to a safer place. Captain Robert Alden stood by the entrance to the intake tent, a white smear of bandage tucked into a breast pocket, a soft crease at the corner of his mouth when he smiled. There was the air of someone who had learned to keep noise out of his gestures. The head nurse, a compact woman with quick eyes and steady hands, organized a small team. "Registration here," she said, voice flat but calm, holding a clipboard like a shield. The clipboards themselves, rows of paper bristling with names and boxes to be checked, would become one of the quiet symbols of the camp: bureaucracy as a form of care. Fear moved through the group in thin waves. They had heard stories of hard labor, of camp discipline, of hunger. They had been trained to expect hostility from the enemy. They had been told that civilians of the opposing state were animals or traitors. Now, as an orderly placed a blanket over a woman whose lips trembled, the propaganda collided with the present fact of another human's steadiness. Someone murmured in German and turned away. Ilse's eyes, dark and observant, tracked the way the nurse's hands folded the blanket with a gentleness that had nothing to do with the uniform. At intake, the checks were efficient without being brusque. Temperature, pulse, weight, measurements became a language meant to translate need into action. A young orderly filled a basin of warm water and handed it to Greta. The steam rising carried a small, trembling promise. Anna was asked her name, her age. She answered in halting phrases, and the nurse repeated, writing it down as if committing her existence to a ledger that would not lose her. For many of these women, the clipboard was the first time in weeks that someone had bothered to ask and to record an answer that would be acted upon. Reports later noted that the camp had arrived with more supplies than the group expected. Stacks of wool blankets, tins of condensed milk, crates of canned vegetables. The record kept the fact flat: supplies, dispatch numbers, ration counts, while the women watched men in the mess hall take trays with practiced motions and fill the younger ones' cups with hot broth. To them, the abundance was not merely logistical, it was an unfamiliar kindness. Elsa's fingers brushed the edge of a blanket as she was handed one. She inhaled, and for a moment the scent of lanolin and starch seemed to rearrange something in her chest. Marthe had been pale from the beginning. She had refused to speak much on the train, answering only when necessary, and once, with a voice threaded through coughing, she had said, "My hands used to make shirts." Now, beneath the fluorescent-like glare of the intake tent's lamps, a nurse noted shallow breathing and a heart that beat as if under strain. Captain Alden examined her with a surgeon's economy of motion. He asked gentle, precise questions. "Can you stand?" he asked. "Can you raise your arm?" The questions were clinical. The tone was human. Marthe fainted once under the thin heat of the tent. An hour of waiting, a missed meal, an accumulation of deprivation, and the orderly beside her was ready with a cool cloth, a raised foot, a murmured assessment. The word anemia passed between the nurse and Captain Alden and fell on the group like a technical fact and a dark horizon at once. Elsa, who had been a nurse before the war, stepped forward quietly and offered to help steady Marthe. She moved with a small, practiced tenderness that surprised the Americans. Something in the way she folded a blanket, in the way she arranged a pillow, said more loudly than any language that the two groups could share the same vocabulary of care. From the outside, the camp ran like a small instrument of order. Rations arrived on schedule. A narrow routine settled into the tents. The camp men and women, soldiers and medical staff, moved with an efficiency that resembled mercy. It was disciplined without cruelty. Beds made straight, bowls washed, hands scrubbed. The presence of American women among the staff, sergeants, nurses, orderlies, mattered. They moved differently from the male guards had. There was a steadiness that did not speak of power, but of task. For the prisoners, many of whom had only known male authority figures, this difference was subtle and deep. Greta, who had been trembling at the entry to the tent, found herself sitting beside a woman sergeant who offered a slice of bread the way a neighbor might offer sugar. The surgical tent smelled of antiseptic and metal. Lamps hung from makeshift frames, light like small suns concentrated over a single table. Captain Alden scrubbed and re-scrubbed, hands steady and unhurried. The head nurse adjusted instruments with a motion that was precise rather than hurried. Marthe's condition had narrowed the staff's concern into a single objective: operate, if necessary, and remove the immediate threat to life. The language used by the staff was spare: local anesthesia, suturing, prepare for incision. They spoke as a crew of craftsmen might, a shared vocabulary that carried no triumph. Before the operation, Marthe's face had the same quiet irony she had shown since arrival: small lines around the mouth, eyes that had learned to measure kindness in increments. She looked at Captain Alden, and in German, a handful of words she had retained, murmured, "If I wake, tell Elsa I am grateful." The request was a private covenant, a recognition of a human who had seen her. The captain answered with a brief nod, translated later by the head nurse into a phrase that was less precise but more useful. She said thank you in advance. The exchange was small, but under the lamps it took on the tone of a ritual. People in the camp watched with a hush. Some sat in the doorway of their barracks. Others lined the perimeter of the yard, hands folded or tucked into sleeves. There is a particular kind of silence that gathers around an operation, not expectant so much as attentive, as if the world had paused in order to hold its breath with the patient. For the women who had been in settings of violence and abrupt endings, this silence felt impossible and, in its impossibility, eminently human. No one yelled orders. There was no clumsy show of force. There was, instead, the steady choreography of people doing what their training had given them to do. The operation itself was described afterward in plain terms. Captain Alden worked with focus. His assistants handed instruments. The head nurse kept count, and Elsa stood near the tent, hands clenched into the hems of her apron. They used terms that were matter-of-fact: bleeding controlled, incision closed. At one point, as the light pooled on Marthe's pale face, a student orderly stepped back and let out a breath he had been holding. When the last suture was placed, some of the watchers exhaled as if lifting a stone. Marthe's was moved to recovery wrapped in blankets that smelled of starch and soap, the same blankets she had earlier seen being piled in a storeroom like small altars of comfort. The aftermath of the surgery did not read like heroics. There were no speeches. Captain Alden spoke quietly to the head nurse and to a junior doctor about follow-up care, nutrition, rest, a plan to increase iron in Mart's diet. The camp's medical ledger recorded the procedure in a few sober lines. The clinical record and the human scene did not contradict one another. They complemented one another. For the women, however, the scene read as dissonant with everything they had been told about the enemy. Here was competence and care offered across a divide that propaganda had made into an abyss. Hygiene became central to the slow work of rebuilding trust. The bathhouse sat low and square, warmed by a boiler that hummed like some domestic heart. Greta's fingers had not known hot water for a long time. When the attendant lifted a ladle and poured a stream across her shoulder, she gasped as if touched by a currency she had forgotten. Elsa assisted at the basin, her movements both efficient and reverent. She washed hair with a tenderness that seemed to say it was permissible to be made clean. Water, in the camp, took on a symbol beyond the practical. It became a brief, embodied promise that bodies could be restored to themselves. Food arrived in small, hot portions. A bowl of stew, a slice of bread, and a small cup of milk. These were not banquets, but the effect on hollowed bodies was visible. Anna ate slowly, measuring each bite, as if learning again that nourishment need not be rationed out of fear. Some of the women refused at first out of distrust. Later, seeing others eat without penalty, they accepted. The mess hall was not silent. It was a place for small talks, for the exchange of names and fragments of the past. Elsa quietly told another woman that she had once tended a child in a small village near the Elbe. The memory arrived soft and surprising, like a song half remembered. Daily routines in the camp reinforced dignity through order. Bed making, latrine detail, assigned kitchen duties, tasks that were framed as contributions rather than punishments. Work was not servitude, but a way to belong to a functioning whole. The data of logistics, how many blankets per person, the schedule of rations, the rotation of shifts, was never presented as an argument. It simply underscored that there was a system oriented toward care. Guards supervised, but were, for the most part, professional rather than vindictive. When a woman resisted a directive out of fear or shame, the response tended toward explanation and reassurance rather than coercion. These small practices, repeated, had a cumulative moral force. The transformation was not immediate. Trust in such a context is granular, accumulating in tiny increments. Ilse watched more than she spoke, her skepticism like an armor made of past disappointments. Yet even she found herself, one afternoon, sitting on a wooden crate and watching a soldier straighten the camp flag with an almost tender motion. "We keep things upright," he said when she noticed him, and his voice had no gloat. It was the ordinary speech of someone invested in small civil acts. The remark lodged in her as a small, disarming truth. Greta touched the soap to her skin and let out a soft laugh, more astonishment than joy at the warmth of it. Anna learned to fold a blanket into a perfect rectangle and felt a modest pride that did not require anyone's permission. Elsa resumed, in small ways, a caregiver's habit, tying a bandage for a blister, advising on a boiled egg, and the patients around her began to respond with tentative gratitude. Mart, after the surgery, slept and slept, waking once to find herself surrounded by blankets and the gentle voice of Captain Alden telling her, in sparse German he had learned from a radio program, that he was glad she had come through. News filtered in through the camp like distant weather, reports of front collapses, of surrenders, of shifting borders. The women received these not as information to be debated, but as part of the context that made their own uncertain futures more complex. Conversation often turned inward, toward family names, toward the small histories that had produced each woman. They compared the texture of their childhood bread, the names of rivers, the sounds of particular dialects. Reconstruction of memory became another form of medicine. Not all moments were soft. There were times when old fears flared. The sudden shout of a drill, the distant bark of an angry voice, reminding the women of the reality from which they had been torn. But the camp's restraint in discipline and the medical staff's measured compassion eroded the immediacy of terror in increments. The women did not become friends of their captors in a single instant. Instead, their internal calculus shifted. Where propaganda had framed the enemy as monstrous, the daily experience rendered them human. A surgeon who cleaned his hands with the same soap as any nurse. A guard who paused to help an elderly woman tie a shoelace. A clerk who learned to say a name correctly, returning the dignity of pronunciation. At night, under the Texas sky, the yard quieted. Lamps burned low, throwing their cones of light onto neat rows of canvas. Women lay on cots, blankets tucked up to their chins, and in the hush, the camp itself seemed to take a collective inhalation. Some whispered memories of the war like talismans. Others tried to sleep. Captain Alden made his rounds with a flashlight and did not speak much, but his presence became part of the comfort for those who could acknowledge it. Once, when Anna could not sleep, she watched him sit on a crate outside the medical tent and write something in a small notebook. He noticed her watching, offered a brief smile, and then returned to his notes. No explanation offered, none sought. Weeks folded into the rhythm of the camp. Tasks became small rituals. Clipboards continued to register changes in weight and temperature and mood. The women learned the cadence of treatment and the small mechanics of being cared for in a world that had previously taught them only to be wary. Elsa, who had once been a nurse, began to help in the infirmary with the staff's permission. Her hands remembered the ways to fold gauze and to check a pulse. To watch her work was to see a continuity between past and present that reassured others. "Later, I wrote," she would say years afterward, in a sparse line that made its way into a memoir, how the simple acts of washing and feeding gave us back our sense of time. The moment that felt like a turning point, the narrative hinge that many survivors later referenced, was not dramatic so much as accumulative. It occurred one morning when Martra, fully awake and sitting on the edge of her cot, was offered a bowl of thin porridge. She paused, spoon in hand, and looked at the head nurse who had arranged the ward. "You have no reason to be kind to us," Martra muttered, not as accusation, but as observation. The nurse looked at her and answered with a sentence that carried no defense. "We have reason to be human," she said, and the phrase settled between them like a small, undeniable fact. The surgery had become an emblem. It showed, plainly and without rhetoric, that the camp's priorities invested in life rather than in humiliation. The experience shifted the women's imaginations, if not erasing the history that had birthed their fear, then offering a different map for the future. For Ilsa, it meant considering that the men and women in uniform around her were not embodiments of an abstract enemy, but people whose competence and decency could not be explained away by slogans. Still, endings were not tidy. Word came that some would be repatriated, others held longer as investigations proceeded. The question of home remained complicated. What did home mean after the fractures of war? The camp prepared lists, papers moved between offices, and soldiers checked manifests. The clipboards, ever present, recorded departures as cleanly as they had recorded arrivals. For each woman leaving Camp Hearn, there was a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Gratitude for having been kept alive and tended to, sorrow for a country and a past broken by politics and violence. On the morning one group prepared to leave, blankets rolled and possessions gathered in the small sacks allowed by regulation, Martra sat upright and, for a moment, allowed herself a smile that reached her eyes. She thanked Elsa, and then, with a steadiness she had not known when she first arrived, she turned to Captain Alden. "You gave me my hands back," she said. The sentence was literal and metaphorical at once. The surgery had repaired a physical threat, but her capacity to work, to make, to touch had been restored in a deeper sense. Captain Alden inclined his head, a small and private acknowledgment. As they boarded the same freight cars that had brought them, the women carried in their bundles not only threadbare garments, but something harder to fold away, a memory that could not be neatly repacked. The image of a surgeon's steady hands, the feel of hot water, the precise ordering of blankets, all of it had complicated the story they had been taught. Elsa watched them go with a measured expression, and, perhaps out of reflex, smoothed an invisible crease from each departing woman's sleeve as if to press a last benediction into fabric. Later, when historians or interviewers asked what had shifted for them inside Camp Hearn, answers varied in length and tone. Some spoke of the practical, the steady meals, the clean sheets, the surgical competence. Others said less precise things, how ordinary gestures had taken on a weight they had not expected, how a ledger could feel like a protection rather than a threat. Ilse would later write in a short note found among papers deposited in an archive, "We were given the strange mercy of being treated as persons." The line reads without flourish, but with a moral clarity that historians find difficult to contest. The ledger and the anecdotes fit together into a single thesis. Disciplined systems, when oriented toward care rather than humiliation, have the power to restore dignity. This was not to suggest innocence where guilt had been present on broader stages. The larger politics that produced war and suffering remained complex and morally fraught. Yet within the small geometry of Camp Hearn, daily routines and professional competence created a counter-argument to dehumanization. The clipboards did not erase history, they simply held names and needs in a way that made action possible. There are images that linger: a nurse's palm smoothing a blanket, steam rising from a basin as Greta lowered her head, the small flare of light over a surgical table. And these images are not easily reconciled with the propaganda that had taught hatred. They remain, for those who survived and for those who witnessed the records, a testament to what disciplined care can do in the ruins of conflict. The camp's record closed with formal notations. The women dispersed into uncertain futures. But Camp Hearn's ordinary acts, registration, measurement, the administration of warmth, left an extraordinary trace in conscience. It is a trace that asks the viewer to consider how institutions might choose to wield power, as means of domination or as frameworks for sustaining life. The women who came to the camp carried away aches and memories, but also a small stubborn knowledge that care, administered with order and a steady hand, could surprise and reorient even those who had been taught to expect only harm. The surgery had been the moment the camp realized its own capacity to keep faith with human life. The bathhouse and the plate of stew showed how day-to-day routines could stitch a frayed sense of self back together. That is the outline of the unbelievable reaction. Not a sudden conversion of loyalties, but an incremental moral reorientation born of persistent, ordinary acts. The rest of the camp watched and waited as Martyr recovered beneath the lamps. And when the last suture held and the blankets were folded, that watched silence lifted like a soft tide. For those who had arrived with fear, the small certainties of care began to matter more than grand narratives of enmity. The experience did not erase sorrow, but it planted, in the minds of women who had known deprivation, a stubborn seed of trust that would travel with them long after the train pulled away. When the last freight car rattled away, Camp Hearn did not so much dissolve as exhale. Doors that had been opened and shut 1,000 times closed once more. Lamps that had stayed lit for shifts of weary hands went out in sequence. The washroom faucets, having poured hot water for dozens of women, were turned off and left to cool. For a few hours, the camp seemed to hold its breath, as if whatever life it had been sustaining waited to see whether the flames beneath the kettles would be rekindled or the embers allowed to die. Mart lay awake beneath a blanket with her repaired wrist resting across her chest. The bandage was small, clean, a crisp rectangle that had once meant survival and now meant an awkward newness to gesture. She flexed her fingers slowly, counting the small joints like a child learning to spell. Each motion was a precise, private astonishment. To lift a cup without pain, to button a coat with one hand instead of two, to feel the pulse of a seam between her thumb and index finger. Beside her, a small bundle of cloth, threads and cloth cuttings from the evenings when other women mended clothes for each other, smelled faintly of soap and boiled starch. She reached for it and stopped, unsure whether this was gratitude or the trivial impulse of someone grateful for the solidity of everyday things. Greta came in before dawn, bringing with her the habit of a person who had long been scheduled to rise. She moved through the bunks with the efficient tenderness of someone who had learned to measure solace by small acts, folding extra blankets, adjusting a pillow, replacing a cup of water. When she crouched by Mart to untie the bandage, her hands were deliberate, unhurried. They had steadied another's tremor too many times to mistake ceremony for sentiment. "You'll have to be careful for a week," she said, as if cataloging weather. "Don't lift anything heavy. Go slow." "I know how to go slow," Mart replied, and neither woman needed to say whether that caution was about the wrist alone or about the world outside the camp's fence. At the gate, Captain Alden waited with a small leather satchel. He had not been part of the surgical teams. His duties were administrative and external, the geometry of order that made space for other hands to do their work. He had watched the women leave earlier from the ramp and had seen, in the way they held their bundles, a kind of careful economy. Those who carried little clutched it as if it were a talisman. Those with larger quilts folded them around themselves like a shield. He had seen Elsa at the platform, smoothing sleeves as if pressing benediction into fabric, and he had felt, surprisingly, painfully, the awkwardness of gratitude offered to him in a meeting of eyes. He offered Mart a small coin to pay for a train ticket, and she refused with the particular politeness of someone who knew how to accept help without relinquishing dignity. "Keep it," Alden said, "for sewing supplies." He tried to make his tone casual, but the gesture landed between them with the weight of a promise. For a moment neither spoke of tomorrow. They talked about nothing more than the weather, about where railway timetables tended to cluster, about a bakery near the station that warmed its plain loaves in the same way each morning. The banalities were a tether to a world that was both risk and refuge. When she finally stepped onto the freight car, her fingers tightened for a second around the strap of her bundle. One of the other women, someone Mart had only once passed soup to across a table, pressed a small square of fabric into her hand. "For you," the woman said, "for when you sew." Mart blinked, then smiled. The smile was not theatrical. It was an instrument she had learned to use to measure the distance between fear and expectation. Elsa stood at the edge of the platform as the train began to move, her figure a clear, unmoving shape against the sky. She watched until the cars dwindled to a line and then to a smear of motion. After that she returned to the camp with her hands empty and her mind full of small, precise memories. Of a surgeon's silhouette bending over a table, of steam rising from basins, of Greta's steady breath. She went to the records shed and pulled the ledger from its place. The ink had dried but not yet faded. Names, dates, notations. The ledger meant nothing spectacular, and yet to Elsa it felt like a quiet testament. It was an argument made in handwriting, that routines could, under some circumstances, be instruments of repair rather than instruments of erasure. Captain Alden did not linger at the camp. He had forms to file and reports to make, but he found himself walking the perimeter on his way out as if he hoped the fence might whisper answers back. He stopped by the bathhouse and placed his palm on the cold lip of the basin. The metal was hard and unyielding. It did not give him absolution, nor did he think it should. He only wanted, perhaps, to register the sensation of contact with something his hands helped steward. In that small silence he understood that what had happened at Camp Hearn would never be reducible to simple categories of right and wrong. Care could be practiced by institutions that also served brutal ends elsewhere. To recognize that did not cleanse anyone's hands. It only complicated the ledger with new margins. Outside the camp, the world responded in the uneven rhythms of rumor and memory. Some villages welcomed the women back reluctantly, as if the proximity to a fence had left an odor that people misread for guilt. Others received them with stubborn domesticity, an extra bowl at the table, a child given a chair at the craftsman's table. Several of the women slipped into occupations that were familiar, stitching and mending for neighbors, laundering for families who had once turned them away. Work, small physical tasks, was a form of therapy and of testimony both. In town, a tailor employed a woman who had learned in the camp to cut cloth in a straight, economical way. She became known for seams that lasted. Men whose jackets had once been threadbare found them restored. Not all returns were seamless. A few women attempted to reclaim the names they had borne before displacement and discovered that those names had been reinterpreted in their absence, spoken with variations that relieved memory from responsibility. One woman, an excellent seamstress who had spent years abroad prior to the war, found herself reduced by gossip to a stereotype. Her work remained impeccable. The whispered questions about where she had been did not. She threaded needles in the morning and, in the evenings, wrote a short letter to Elsa that contained nothing of protest and everything of arithmetic. A list of clients, the price of cloth, the number of stitches required for a child's coat. The letters were not letters of thanks so much as logistical reports that preserved a connection forged in the camp's dry light. Ilsa's note, when it surfaced among donated papers to an archive, became a small, sharp object in scholarly debates. Curators argued over how to present such an ambiguous record. There were those who wanted to place Camp Hearn into a narrative of institutional evil to show how regimes of order could serve ideological harm. They were right in one register. But there were also scholars who insisted upon the ledger's counter-evidence, orderly routines, medical competence, the pragmatic administration of aid. The two readings did not cancel each other, they collided. Lectures were given, panels convened, and, behind the formal arguments, students and listeners murmured among themselves about how easily human beings moved from categories of enemy to neighbor when daily acts circumvented the grand narratives imposed upon them. Years later, at a small commemorative service attended by a handful of former staff and a larger number of family members of those who had passed through the camp, Captain Alden spoke only a few sentences. "We were given a charge," he said, choosing his words as if threading a delicate seam. "We were taught a procedure. We were given resources. We applied them. Whether the application was sufficient is not mine to say alone." His voice betrayed the peculiar exhaustion of someone who had been tasked with the mechanics of care and who had found the ethics of that care insoluble in forms. Ilsa's note, when it surfaced among donated papers to an archive, became a small, sharp object in scholarly debates. Curators argued over how to present such an ambiguous record. There were those who wanted to place Camp Hearn into a narrative of institutional evil, to show how regimes of order could serve ideological harm. They were right in one register, but there were also scholars who insisted upon the ledger's counter-evidence, orderly routines, medical competence, the pragmatic administration of aid. The two readings did not cancel each other, they collided. Lectures were given, panels convened, and, behind the formal arguments, students and listeners murmured among themselves about how easily human beings moved from categories of enemy to neighbor when daily acts circumvented the grand narratives imposed upon them. Years later, at a small commemorative service attended by a handful of former staff and a larger number of family members of those who had passed through the camp, Captain Alden spoke only a few sentences. "We were given a charge," he said, choosing his words as if threading a delicate seam. "We were taught a procedure. We were given resources. We applied them. Whether the application was sufficient is not mine to say alone." His voice betrayed the peculiar exhaustion of someone who had been tasked with the mechanics of care and who had found the ethics of that care insoluble in forms. He left a single page from the ledger on a table at the front of the room. It was not a confession and not an apology. It was a record made visible. Martyr returned twice to the camp over the next decade. Once she brought a girl with hair the color of straw, her niece, who had survived by being sheltered by distant relatives. The other time she came to lay a small bundle on the threshold, a patchwork quilt whose stitches were tight and even. "For the bed," she told Elsa, "so the blankets will hold together." Elsa accepted the quilt with a quiet that meant more than thanks. The quilt hung in the washroom for a while, used as a cover for an extra stool, and then, when the camp building was repurposed years later, it was moved to the town's chest of artifacts, where it became an everyday object that nobody thought to glorify. Greta moved to a neighboring village and opened a small clinic. She kept a box of bandages and a ledger of appointments, in which she wrote fewer formal notes and more scribbled observations: a child's fever, an old man's cough. Her hands, which had learned in the camp to measure tenderness by temperature, were steady and kind. People came to her not because they believed institutions to be benign, but because they knew that, sometimes, ordinary competence conferred unexpected mercy. She never spoke about the politics that had created the camp. She spoke instead about the rightness of a wound properly dressed. Survivors told stories differently as they grew older. Some rehearsed moments of gratitude with the crispness of ritual, names of nurses and surgeons, the exact order of a meal. Others changed the emphasis, focusing less on the surgical table than on the quieter scenes: a woman passing a cup across a table, a child taught to count stitches, the way beds were arranged so that no one slept more than 2 nights without sunlight. The variations were not contradictions. They were testimony to the ways minds remembered what had mattered most in survival. For some, the surgeon's hands remained the central image. For others, it was the ledger, the fact that someone wrote their name down as if it had a weight that required preservation. At the archive where Ilsa's papers rested, a young researcher named Matteo found, tucked between pages of clinical notes, a scrap of writing that had not been part of any formal inventory. It was a small, almost elegiac instruction: "Measure for warmth. Leave no one with cold hands." He did not know who had penned it. He only knew that the lines smoothed across his chest in the same way a blanket might. He photographed it and placed the image in a file, and then, when the workday ended, walked home with the feeling of having discovered something slight and important. In an age of grand narratives that were fiercely fought over, the instruction felt like a minor commandment, an insistence that life be tended. The larger debates about Camp Hearn did not resolve. Politicians used its story when it suited them, and critics used it when it exposed paradoxes they wanted to emphasize. But beneath the polemics, there remained the simple and stubborn fact that small acts of care had altered the trajectories of certain people's lives. That fact was not a redemption of a system that had, elsewhere, perpetrated harm. It was not even an argument that institutions by nature should be trusted. It was rather an empirical answer to a question of means, that practices structured toward sustaining life could, in concrete terms, restore fingernail, appetite, hope. On a late autumn afternoon many years after the camp's final day, Elsa went to the place where the bathhouse had stood. The building had been taken down long ago. Its stones were scattered, used for a wall on a farm. She sat on the new wall and folded her hands in her lap. The town's wind pushed leaves against her knees. She thought of the surgeon whose face she had never learned to know, of Greta and her steady clinic, of Martyr's small, sure hands. She thought of the ledger and the women who had learned to measure life in the rhythm of meals and stitches. She did not think of absolution. Instead, she thought of obligation and of the need to decide each day how to employ whatever authority one held. As dusk fell, she smoothed the crease in her skirt, not unlike the way she had once smoothed a departing woman's sleeve. The motion was small, habitual, and utterly private. She watched the light go thin and then cut out. The memory of steam rising from a basin held its shape in her mind like a photograph. Neither blistering nor sentimental, only true. For all the complexities that history would unpack and reassemble, that image remained. A concentrated instance of what disciplined attention could do when oriented toward preserving rather than diminishing a human life. There was no tidy moral that could reconcile the ledger with the politics that had made such a ledger necessary. But there was an argument, lived in the tenderness of small tasks, that institutions could be instruments of either harm or healing, depending on how their routines were staffed and oriented. The choice, Elsa understood, did not belong to policy manuals alone. It belonged to the people who woke up early, to the hands that learned to stitch, to the men and women who decided what a form should record and what a basin should hold. In that understanding lived a measure of responsibility that outlasted the camp itself. She rose and walked back toward town beneath the indifferent stars, carrying with her the quiet knowledge that the righting of one wrist was at once small and monumental, a repair that would neither redeem a nation nor erase a crime, but that would, in 100 subtle ways, allow a woman to stitch edges back together and, in doing so, to re-enter the slow commerce of life. The town lights flickered on. In the distance, a train sounded. The sound was ordinary, and somehow not, an echo of movement, of departure, and of the persistent, ambiguous work of being human. He stood at the foot of the farm wall before she had finished crossing the lane. Matteo's coat was thin against the autumn air. His hands clasped a small envelope. Elsa paused without looking up, as if waiting to see whether the train's distant sound would swallow the moment. It did not. He walked the last few steps and stopped a respectful distance away. "Miss Hearn?" he said. The name had the careful cadence of someone who had learned it from a roster, then practiced it aloud until it ceased to sound like a thing and became a person. She turned. The town's last light slanted against his cheekbones, making his face seem smaller, as if youth were a shape he might tuck away. "Matteo," she answered, simple as the greeting she once used under the white lamp in the clinic. She had not expected visitors that evening. She had expected only the ordinary loneliness that comes after a day's account is balanced against memory. She stepped down from the wall. "What brings you here?" He held out the envelope. "I thought you might want this." There was a pause, as if the envelope itself required ceremony. Elsa took it. It smelled faintly of photocopy paper and dust. Inside, folded once, was the square photograph he had taken in the archive. The scrap of handwriting, "Measure for warmth. Leave no one with cold hands." She did not unfold it at once. She let the image rest between her fingers, felt the slight give of paper and the way the letters were arranged, some leaning like people seeking shelter. The words were not unknown to her. She had read them before in her own working lists, in the way she had been taught to count and then to care. Yet to see them offered by another was to be reminded that the thing one habitually held could be returned as a gift. "How did you come upon it?" she asked. "Sorting," he said. "The ledger you kept, it was there among notes from the infirmary, but not catalogued as ledger. A nurse's scrap, perhaps. Whoever wrote it didn't want it recorded in the usual places." He drew in a breath. "There are people who want to put things behind glass. There are others who want to put them on pedestals. I thought you might prefer—" He stopped, searching for the right word, then chose another, "to know where it had turned up." Elsa considered the town wall, the scattered stones that had once been mortar and steam. "Catalogued," she repeated. The word, flattened by time, had edges that still caught her. And what will those who catalogue it want? To explain it? To make a moral of it? "Some will," Matteo said. "Others will want a literal reading. Some will want to paint the ledger as proof that care once existed, and therefore the whole must be forgiven. Others will point at it and say its existence proves nothing. Systems did harm, a few hands cannot be a remedy." She closed her fingers around the photograph. "They will say many things," she said. "They always do." There was no impatience in her voice, only the slow steadiness of someone who had learned to stand while others spoke. "What do you want to do with it, Matteo?" He looked at her then in the open way people look when they have learned a difficult affection for the truth. "I want to make a record that does not pretend to be a verdict," he said. "I am putting together an exhibition, not to absolve, not to hide, but to show manner. To show what work looked like when people tried to keep each other whole even in a place that demanded different things. I thought perhaps you'd speak, not to forgive the rest, but to explain what compelled that line." Elsa felt the words in her body before she let them loose. Compel. She had been compelled, in small daily increments, by the sight of a hand extended, by the noise of an interrupted stitch, by hunger. It was not heroism, it was a refusal to slide under the weight of what had been asked of them. "And what will you call it?" she asked. Matteo's answer came quickly. "Measure for Warmth." For a moment Elsa pictured the title on a placard, neat type, the photograph behind glass, paragraphs of exegesis for visitors with clean shoes. The image struck her as both right and inadequate. "Will you include the ledger?" she asked. "All of it," he said, "with context, with names where we can find them, but also with the holes, the refusals, the lost sheets. We will not pretend the ledger made good. But I want people to linger on the parts that were life-affirming, to remember that forms can be written toward care as much as control." She thought of the surgeon whose face she had never known, of Greta and of Mart, of the quiet choreography of the bathhouse. She thought, too, of the ledger as a thing that could be read in many keys, as evidence, as artifact, as a relic. There was danger in each. "Will you have survivors speak?" she asked. "Yes," Matteo replied. "If they want to. I hope you will. There must be room for those who chose not to come, and those whose choice was taken from them. I cannot force memory. I can invite it to a place where others might listen." Elsa's thumb smoothed the margin of the photograph. Outside, a wind shuffled the leaves, each like a small applause. "I will come," she said, "but I will not let them think a bath cures a nation. There is a difference between tending a wound and pretending it never existed." Matteo exhaled, and the sound was almost like relief. "I don't want them to pretend either." They stood for a while without speech. The town settled deeper into dark. From the lane, a dog barked twice and stopped, having relayed a message that was perhaps only to itself. Elsa folded the photograph and tucked it into her pocket as if carrying a coin. "When is this?" she asked. "In 2 months," he said. "Enough time to prepare labels and to trace as many names as possible. Enough time to build a frame that does not make the thing small." She nodded. "Then we will spend these months measuring for warmth in our own way," she said, "and we will be honest about the ledger's limits." He smiled, younger and a little astonished. "That is what I hoped you'd say." After he left, she walked back through town. The town's light had thinned to the windows of a few homes, and figures moved behind curtains. The ordinary choreography of lives that had bulked up gently around the past but were not bound by it. Elsa returned to her modest house, made tea, and sat by the small window that overlooked the lane. The photograph lay on the table, face up, a simple script under glassy light. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. Matteo sorted and located and called. Some voices answered warmly, others chose silence. Greta traveled from clinic to clinic, her hands slower now but steady. She agreed to sit for an interview because she wanted, as she said, to put the stitches in order at last. Martyr sent a boxed bundle of his old sewing tools, his letter modest. "They are not relics," he wrote, "only things that were needed." The surgeon's name remained a shadow until a hospital in a neighboring city released a roster. And even then the face did not come with the explanations they sought. Names, as it turned out, gave generous and stingy gifts. The exhibition took shape in a converted reading room of the municipal library. Walls that had once displayed local flora now held large prints. The ledger pages replicated in careful ink, the bathhouse plan rendered in pencil, photographs of hands, greasy, blistered, clean, performing the small mathematics of care. Matteo wrote placards that tried to balance criticism and gratitude. He quoted scholars and survivors alike. At the center, beneath efficient lighting, was the photograph. "Measure for warmth. Leave no one with cold hands." Visitors circled it the way one circled a small bright thing on a table. Respectful, observant, sometimes puzzled. Opening night arrived like any other small civic event. People came with coats, with names, with an appetite for closure or chastisement, or perhaps for simple curiosity. Photographers took pictures as if memory were a commodity, and a local reporter, who had spent years framing the camp as an instrument in a larger narrative, wrote an article that used the ledger as both token and rebuke. Some letters to the editor were fierce. How could anyone display a thing from such a place without indicting the whole? Others were tender, recalling meals and nurses and the human scale of help. Elsa stood in a back corner while people moved from panel to panel. She had agreed to speak, as Matteo had asked, but she had not planned to appear first. Instead, she wanted to feel the room, to see how the ledger read itself on strangers' faces. For a long time, she watched a young woman who lingered before the photograph. The woman's hands were thin but sure. She had a baby strapped to her chest and a look of recognition on her face, an understanding that some instructions, once learned, travel across generations. When the curator took the podium and thanked donors, Matteo's voice trembled briefly. He spoke of choices, of the decision to place the scrap not as a talisman, but as an artifact whose meaning could be argued. "We do not ask you to forgive," he said. "We ask you to see how careful attention persisted. We ask you to consider how the practices of care might be made available without returning power to those who abused it." His phrase landed in the room, modest and firm. There were heads that nodded, and some that did not. Elsa took the podium after him. She did not read a statement so much as offer a conversation. "I will tell you what it meant to us," she said plainly. "It meant beginning again, every morning, with a small decision: to warm a basin, to count spoons, to fold a blanket. It did not make what was done elsewhere right. It did not dissolve responsibility. It was a way to keep someone here, to let them mend. Some of you will call that small. Some of you will call it necessary. I will call it what it was, the moral practice of a day. She paused. In the audience, someone exhaled. The young woman with the child had tears in her eyes. An older man clasped both hands behind his head as if to hold himself upright. "We must remember the ledger in its fullness," Elsa continued. "Name the harms, name the people who ordered them. But we must also remember how people, within those frames, found ways to keep each other whole. That is the obligation that outlives any policy. It is ours to teach." At the back of the room, a survivor whom they had invited stood very still. She later said she had not wanted to speak, that the act of speaking might make her memory into a public thing she could no longer manage. But afterward, when a young man thanked her with a hand that trembled, she squeezed his fingers and then left the room on an arm that did not seem falteringly old at all. The exchange was small. The man walked away clutching the fact of the squeeze as if it were a map. Not all returned from the exhibition outwardly altered. Some people left feeling absolved by the presence of small benevolent acts. Others left angrier, convinced the display papered over cruelty. Neither reaction surprised Elsa. She had long ago stopped seeking unanimity. Her aim, private and narrow, was simply that more hands be taught the old instruction: measure for warmth. Months later, after the frames had been taken down, after the pamphlets had been filed, the photograph passed into the hands of a school teacher who wanted to convert the line into an exercise for children. "What does measure mean?" she asked a class of 11-year-olds. They argued about quantities and metaphors, and finally agreed. To measure is to notice. To notice is to respond. The teacher pinned a copy of the photograph on a board, and beneath it tacked a sheet where the children had written their own small commandments. Fill the bird feeder. Say hello to the lonely neighbor. Bring a blanket for a stray cat. Meanwhile, Matteo returned to the archive. He had become less a curator than a kind of midwife for facts, delivering documents back into public light and then stepping aside. He found, in another box, a ledger page that recorded the names of women who had been taught to sew by Martra. There were, surprisingly, notes about the recipes used to fortify thin bodies, hashes and gruels that had been measured not merely by calories, but by the steadiness they could lend to a hands-on life. His files grew with small tests of tenderness. Elsa continued to stitch. She visited Greta when she could. She sat once with the surgeon's sister, an elderly woman who had lived with silence long enough that she had learned to keep company with it. They spoke quietly about decisions made in corridors and about mistakes that should still be named. They did not seek consolation by analogy. They sought, rather, to trace the practical paths they might take to ensure that a future ledger would look different by design. In the evenings, Elsa sometimes opened the envelope Matteo had given her and smoothed the square until the ink softened with use. The line, "Measure for warmth, leave no one with cold hands," was not a prescription she had ever believed would change the whole. It was, instead, a tiny liturgy to be practiced in kitchens and infirmaries and neighborhoods. Its power was not in the line itself, but in the people who repeated it day after day, learning that small repetitions, stacked like stones, can sometimes hold a fragile road across a marsh. The town, as towns do, kept its contradictions: political speeches that favored forgetting, ceremonies that conflated culpability with benevolence, memorials that sought tidy summaries. But there were also kitchens where a woman taught a child to thicken soup so it might warm more than the stomach. There were neighbors who learned to hang a blanket out to air rather than fold it away like a secret. There were hands that acquired the muscle of noticing. On a raw morning nearly a year after the photograph had been found, Elsa walked again to the place where the bathhouse had stood. The farm wall had been widened. A sapling now leaned against its stones, patient and tentative. She sat and watched the town begin unhurriedly. A boy ran past, scarf trailing, carrying a wooden crate. Through the ordinary movements of the day, she felt the ledger's aftersound. People had learned in small and stubborn ways to tend one another. She unfolded the photograph one last time and read the line aloud, softly, as if speaking to an audience of one. "Measure for warmth," she said. "Leave no one with cold hands." The phrase was not a verdict nor a vindication. It was an instruction for the long business of living. She folded the paper carefully and placed it in her coat pocket near the stiff bit of a ticket stub someone might keep for luck. Then she rose and walked back toward the town, boots striking a steady rhythm. The train sounded in the distance, moving as it always had, neither repairing history nor erasing it, only passing through. And for the people who were left to make small decisions every morning, that was enough reason to begin again.